Why trying to be somebody is making you unhappy? Ram Dass answer. All right, guys. Let's kick this video off with a question that's been on my mind. Why do we spend so much of our lives trying to be somebody? You know what I'm talking about, right? That constant pressure to become something or someone that society, or maybe even we ourselves, think we're supposed to be. Maybe it's about being successful, famous, or admired. Or maybe it's about being the perfect friend, partner, or parent. Whatever it is, we're all chasing this idea of being somebody, but the real question is it making you happy? Let's think about it. From the moment we're born, we're handed a script. We're told who we should be, what kind of life we should lead, what success looks like, and what will supposedly make us fulfilled. We're taught to constantly strive for something outside of ourselves. We build identities based on the roles we play in society, and before we know it, we're trapped in this endless game of becoming. But here's the kicker: the more we try to be somebody, the further we drift from who we really are. Ram Dass, a legendary philosopher and spiritual teacher, once said that the pursuit of becoming somebody is one of the main reasons people are so unhappy. Think about it. When you're constantly trying to live up to an image, whether it's one you've created or one that society has imposed on you, how can you ever feel at peace? You're always one step away from where you think you should be. And that gap between where you are and where you want to be creates this nagging sense of dissatisfaction. Let me ask you this: have you ever stopped to ask yourself, who am I trying to impress seriously? Think about that for a second. Are you chasing this idea of being somebody for yourself, or is it because you think it's what will make others respect or love you? The truth is, most of us are caught up in the game of appearances. We want to fit in, to be recognized, to stand out. And so we put on masks, we adopt personas, and we craft these identities that we think will make us valuable in the eyes of the world. But here's the problem: when you're busy trying to be somebody, you're not being yourself. And when you're not being yourself, there's this underlying tension inside of you. You feel like something's missing, even if you can't quite put your finger on it. That's because you're not connected to your true nature. You're living from the outside in instead of from the inside out. Ram Dass teaches that the reason we're unhappy is because we've forgotten who we really are. We've become so identified with our roles, our accomplishments, and our societal labels that we've lost touch with the deeper, truer part of ourselves. We think we are these separate individual entities that need to achieve and accumulate in order to have meaning. But the truth is, we're already enough as we are. We just don't realize it because we're too busy trying to be somebody.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Here's a really deep question for you. What would happen if you stopped trying to be somebody? What if you let go of all the labels, the roles, and the expectations that you've been carrying around? Who would you be if you weren't trying to prove anything to anyone? That's a tough one, right? Because for most of us, our entire identity is wrapped up in this idea of becoming somebody. We think that if we stop, we'll be nothing. We'll disappear. But Ram Dass says that when you let go of the false self, the ego-driven self, you don't lose yourself. Instead, you discover your true self, which is beyond all the roles and labels you've been playing. Let's break it down even more logically. If your happiness is tied to being somebody, then you're always going to be subject to the rise and fall of external circumstances. Your sense of self-worth will be fragile, dependent on how well you perform in your various roles. But if your happiness comes from simply being, from connecting with who you are beneath all the layers, then no external situation can shake you. You're no longer chasing an ideal. You're just living from a place of authenticity. The crazy thing is, the more you stop trying to be somebody, the more free you become. You don't need to pretend anymore. You don't need to live for the future or for others' approval. You start to live in the present, fully aware that you're already complete. And in that space, real happiness arises, not the kind of happiness that comes and goes with success or failure, but a deeper, more lasting contentment that's rooted in your true nature. The ego trap: how our identities keep us chained to illusions. All right, so now that we've started to unpack why trying to be somebody keeps us unhappy, let's dive into the next layer: the ego. The ego is the part of us that's obsessed with being somebody. It's that voice in your head that constantly says, I need to achieve more, or I need to prove myself. It's the part of you that's always comparing, always competing, always trying to one-up the person next to you. And here's the thing: the ego's never satisfied. Even when you think you've achieved what you wanted, it just moves the goalpost. Here's a question for you: how often do you feel content with where you are, without thinking about what's next? If you're like most people, the answer is probably not very often. That's because the ego thrives on dissatisfaction. It needs this sense of lack to keep itself going. It convinces you that you're not enough as you are, and that you need to become more, do more, or have more. But the truth is, the ego is playing a trick on you. It's like a mirage in the desert. Just when you think you've reached it, it disappears, and you find yourself chasing something else. Ram Dass talks a lot about the ego as a kind of prison. It keeps us trapped in a cycle of endless striving, always searching for happiness outside of ourselves. The ego convinces us that if we can just become somebody, then we'll finally find peace. But as we've already discussed, that peace never comes. Because the ego doesn't want peace, it wants control. It wants to maintain its identity, to feel separate, special, and superior. And in doing so, it keeps you disconnected from your true self. Here's the paradox: the more you try to build up your ego, the more you reinforce the very thing that's causing your suffering. When your identity is wrapped up in your ego, you become a slave to external validation. You need constant approval from others to feel good about yourself. And because the ego is always looking for what's wrong, what needs to be fixed or improved, you end up feeling like you're never enough. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much you pour in, it's never full. Let's pause for a moment and ask a deep question: what would your life look like if you weren't driven by the need to be somebody? If you weren't trying to protect or enhance your ego, who would you be? This is where things get really interesting. Without the ego's constant demands, you start to realize that you don't need to be somebody to be complete. In fact, the very idea of being somebody is an illusion. You're not this fixed, separate identity that needs to prove itself. You're something much deeper, much more expansive. Ram Dass suggests that true freedom comes when we stop identifying with the ego. This doesn't mean we destroy the ego or get rid of it entirely. That's impossible. The ego is part of being human, but what we can do is recognize it for what it is: a tool, not the master. When we see the ego clearly, we stop letting it run the show. We stop believing its stories about who we need to be or what we need to achieve in order to feel worthy. Here's the thing: the ego thrives on separation. It creates this false sense that we're all these individual, isolated somebodies competing for limited resources, whether that's attention, love, or success. But Ram Dass teaches that beyond the ego, we're all connected. We're all part of something much larger, much more profound. When you step out of the ego's trap, you begin to see that your true nature isn't separate from others. It's interconnected, and in that realization, the need to be somebody falls away, because you understand that you already are everything you're trying to become. The illusion of separation, while letting go of somebody, brings you closer to everyone now, that we're starting to see how the ego traps us in this constant need to be somebody. Let's go even deeper. If the ego is all about separation, about creating this false sense that you're a distinct, individual entity who needs to compete, achieve, and be recognized, what happens when you let go of that? What happens when you stop buying into the illusion that you're separate from everyone else? Ram Dass teaches that the ego thrives on this illusion of separation. It convinces us that we're all these isolated, individual selves moving through the world on our own, trying to carve out a place for ourselves. But here's the thing that's not real. The idea that you are this fixed, separate somebody is just a construct. It's something we've been conditioned to believe, but it's not the full truth of who you are. Beneath the layers of the ego, beneath the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, there's a deeper, more fundamental connection that we all share. This is what Ram Dass calls the realization that, at our core, we're all part of the same thing. We're not separate beings competing for limited resources. We're all interconnected, like waves on the ocean. The waves may look different on the surface, but they're all part of the same water. And that's the key. When you stop identifying so strongly with your individual wave, you start to feel your connection to the whole ocean. Here's a mind-bending question for you. What if the person you're trying to become doesn't really exist? What if the somebody you've been striving to be is just an illusion created by the ego? And what if, by letting go of that, you don't lose anything, but instead gain everything? Because when you stop seeing yourself as separate, you start to feel this deeper connection to everyone and everything around you. The boundaries between me and you begin to dissolve, and you realize that we're all expressions of the same source. This is where things get really powerful. By letting go of the need to be somebody, you actually open yourself up to a deeper, more meaningful connection with others. The ego, with its constant need for validation and recognition, creates a barrier between you and the people around you. It keeps you locked in this mindset of comparison and competition. But when you release that, you start to see others not as rivals or obstacles, but as fellow travelers on the same journey. You start to see that their pain is your pain, their joy is your joy. You start to feel a sense of compassion and empathy that wasn't possible when you were trapped in the ego's game of separation. Let me ask you this: how often do you feel truly connected to the people in your life? Not just on a surface level, but on a deeper, more spiritual level. If you're like most people, the answer is probably, not as often as I'd like. That's because the ego keeps us disconnected. It keeps us focused on ourselves, on our own individual goals, fears, and desires. But when you let go of the need to be somebody, you create space for genuine connection. You start to see that other people aren't just players in your personal drama, they're reflections of the same consciousness that you are. This shift in perspective changes everything. You stop needing to prove yourself, and you stop needing others to validate your existence. Instead, you start to experience life as this interconnected web of relationships, where everyone's experience is part of the larger whole. And in that space, you find a kind of peace and fulfillment that the ego could never give you. Because the truth is, you're not separate from the people around you. You're not even separate from the world around you. You're part of it, and it's part of you. So here's the takeaway: letting go of being somebody doesn't isolate you. It brings you closer to everyone and everything. It allows you to move through the world with a sense of connection, compassion, and unity that goes far beyond the ego's limited view. And in that space, you discover a deeper sense of belonging, not because you've become somebody, but because you've realized you're already part of everything. Finding freedom in being nobody, how letting go of the ego brings true joy. Here we are, at the final stretch of this journey together. We've explored how the ego traps us in the pursuit of becoming somebody, and how that pursuit only deepens our sense of separation and unhappiness. Now, let's talk about what happens when you truly embrace the idea of being nobody. I know that might sound strange at first. After all, we've been taught our entire lives that we're supposed to be somebody. But here's the thing, the real freedom begins when you stop trying to be someone special. When you stop clinging to the ego's version of success, recognition, or status, you begin to experience life in a way that's so much more profound, peaceful, and joyful. Think about it. When you're no longer trying to protect an image, you become incredibly light. You no longer have to carry the weight of everyone's expectations or even your own. You no longer have to constantly prove yourself or worry about whether you're measuring up. You can simply be. And in that space of just being, there's a kind of freedom that the ego could never offer you. Here's a deep question for you. What would it feel like to no longer care about how others see you? To no longer be concerned with whether you're successful, admired, or important? It sounds radical, but when you stop identifying with the ego's need for validation, you enter a state of profound liberation. Life becomes less about what you do and more about how you experience it. You start to live from a place of presence, from a place of connection, where each moment carries its own richness, regardless of external outcomes. Ram Dass often spoke about this state of being as becoming nobody. It doesn't mean you become nothing or worthless. Quite the opposite, it means you transcend the narrow, limited identity the ego has constructed. You become everything because you're no longer locked into the illusion of being separate. When you let go of the need to be somebody, you realize that who you truly are is boundless, vast, and interconnected with all of life. This is where real joy arises, not the fleeting, ego-based happiness that comes from achieving something or being recognized, but a deeper, more lasting joy. It's the joy of simply being, of existing in harmony with the flow of life. It's the joy of knowing that you don't need to be anything other than what you are, right here, right now. So here's the final takeaway. When you stop trying to be somebody, you discover the freedom of being nobody, and in that, you find everything. True joy, true connection, and true peace come not from achieving or becoming, but from letting go and embracing who you already are, a part of the whole, a part of everything. And that, my friends, is the answer Ram Dass offers to why trying to be somebody is making you unhappy. The real happiness lies in releasing the ego and finding the freedom in just being. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.